Welcome back to Shadowed Pages, my dear friends. I'm Edward, and I'm truly delighted to have you join me once again this evening. Where are you tuning in from today, and how has your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, let's begin. The morning had not yet broken when Miss Marple arrived at the lace-draped house on the hill. Her steps were measured, her mind sharp, and every detail in the surrounding village, every whispered conversation, every cautious glance, etched into her memory. It was not just a murder she had been called upon to investigate. It was the tangled web of secrets that wrapped itself tightly around the victim, like the delicate lace curtains that hung in the windows of the house. The house stood in stark contrast to the humble village that lay at its feet. Its ivory facade, once gleaming in the sun, now looked aged, almost weary, as though it carried the weight of many years, each one etched into its walls. The lace curtains fluttered slightly in the wind, their soft movements betraying the unsettling quiet within. Miss Marple had seen such houses before, full of pride, full of stories, yet so often hiding secrets in their very foundations. The constable, a young man named Pierce, met her at the front door. His face was pale, eyes wide with the tension that seemed to hang in the air. "It's in the sitting room, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "The victim's been... well, it's not a pretty sight." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm, though her mind was already working. "I shall see it for myself," she said simply, stepping inside with quiet grace. The house smelled of stale air and dust, the kind that clung to corners and refused to leave. The sitting room was large and grand, yet there was an odd sense of neglect about it. A fire had burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. But it wasn't the room that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the body. There, sprawled across a velvet armchair, was the late Mrs. Caroline Merton, her hands clutching the delicate lace fabric that draped over her lap. Her face was frozen in a mask of horror, eyes wide and glassy, as though she had seen something she could not possibly comprehend. Miss Marple took a step closer, her eyes scanning the room with careful precision. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. The air was still. Too still. It wasn't the scene of a violent crime, not in the way one might expect. Yet the blood on the floor beneath Mrs. Merton's chair told a different story. Pierce cleared his throat. "We think it might have been poisoning," he said, his words hesitant, as if unsure of the truth they implied. "But we're not sure." Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the lace curtains, their delicate fabric now tainted by the blood stain on the floor. "Poisoning," she murmured, her voice almost a whisper. It wasn't a word to be used lightly, especially not in a case like this. "Tell me about the family, Constable. The husband, the children, anyone who might have had a reason." "Mr. Merton, Caroline's husband, is out of town on business," Pierce replied, his tone lowering. "He won't be back until later today. The children, there's only one, a daughter named Eleanor. She's 20, quiet, always keeping to herself. No one really knows much about her." He paused, as though remembering something. "There's also a servant, Miss Lacey, but she's been with the family for years. She's loyal." "Tell me more about Miss Lacey," Miss Marple asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the body again. "And about Eleanor." Pierce shifted his weight nervously. "Miss Lacey is... well, she's odd, to be honest. Very devoted to Mrs. Merton, but something about her just doesn't sit right with people. As for Eleanor, she's... well, she was very close to her mother. Too close, perhaps. Some say it's unhealthy, the way she's always around." Miss Marple's mind churned. A mother and daughter, both seemingly living in the shadow of something darker. And then there was Miss Lacey, her devotion perhaps a bit too intense. "Have you spoken to the daughter yet?" Miss Marple asked. Pierce hesitated. "Not yet. She's in her room. She's been very upset, of course, but... Then we shall speak with her now, Miss Marple said firmly, already turning toward the door. It's time to make a few things clear. Upstairs, Eleanor Merton's room was small but well kept, decorated in soft shades of cream and lavender. The young woman sat by the window, her back to the door, her face obscured by a veil of dark hair. Miss Marple entered the room, her presence commanding yet gentle. Miss Merton, Miss Marple said softly, I'm sorry for your loss, but I must ask you a few questions. Eleanor didn't turn around immediately, but after a long moment she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what happened, she said, her voice cracking. I wasn't there when it happened. I was in my room. I didn't hear anything. Did your mother have any enemies? Miss Marple asked, her voice smooth but cutting. No, Eleanor replied quickly, her voice too quick. Not that I know of. She was well liked. She was always so kind to people. Always. Miss Marple regarded her silently for a moment. Something was off. Eleanor's eyes darted around the room as if searching for something, some way to avoid Miss Marple's gaze. Do you mind if I take a look around? Miss Marple asked, her tone not one of request but of expectation. Eleanor hesitated, but then nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple moved to the small desk by the window, her eyes scanning the contents. Papers, a few books, and there it was. A Viati's letter. Tucked away under a pile of discarded envelopes, its edges frayed from being hastily stuffed away. Miss Marple picked it up, her fingers delicate as she unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, elegant even, but the words were troubling. A promise, a threat, something about money and someone named R.A. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. It seems your mother had more to worry about than just her household, she said, her voice steady. I believe we have a starting point. Eleanor's eyes widened. No, I don't know what that is, she said, shaking her head. I swear I don't. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately, but her mind was already piecing together the connections, the motives that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. There was more to this murder than anyone was admitting, and soon it would all come to light. The silence in the room was almost suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the house's old wooden beams. Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, her sharp eyes scanning the room with the precision of someone who had seen far too many of these tragic scenes. She felt the weight of Eleanor Merton's eyes on her, the young woman's gaze flickering nervously from one corner of the room to the next. There was something uneasy about her, something that didn't quite fit with the image of a grieving daughter. Miss Marple had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and they were telling her that Eleanor knew more than she was letting on. The problem was, Miss Marple couldn't quite put her finger on what that more was. The young woman seemed genuinely distraught, her hands trembling as they clutched a handkerchief. Yet her words, though carefully chosen, rang with a hint of uncertainty. I can see how much this must be affecting you, Miss Marple said gently, though there was no sympathy in her voice, only an unwavering determination. But I need you to understand something. The truth will come out eventually. It's only a matter of time. Eleanor's lips trembled as she looked at Miss Marple, her voice soft, barely audible. I don't know what happened. I wasn't there when it happened. I was in my room. I didn't hear anything. Miss Marple took a few steps toward the desk, her eyes falling on the stack of papers, the unopened letters, the books that seemed out of place in a room that should have felt like sanctuary rather than a mausoleum. She had been trained to observe, to listen not just to the words people spoke, but to the things they left unsaid, to the way they held themselves when they thought no one was looking. What did your mother usually do in the mornings? Miss Marple asked, her tone unchanged, like a needle poking into the soft fabric of Eleanor's composure. I would imagine she had a routine, something she always did. Eleanor stiffened, her eyes darting toward the door, as if she were considering escaping. But then she shook her head, as if dismissing her own thoughts. She always had her tea in the morning. She liked to sit by the window. I never really disturbed her. She was always so private. Miss Marple considered the words carefully. A woman who enjoyed solitude, someone who preferred not to be disturbed. It didn't quite match with the picture of a loving mother and wife, not entirely. There was a distance there that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. "And what about Miss Lacey?" she asked, her voice still calm, as if speaking of an ordinary matter. "How did she fit into your mother's routine?" At the mention of the servant, Eleanor's face tightened, her fingers gripping the handkerchief more firmly. "Miss Lacey, she's been with us for years. She's very devoted, but sometimes she's too much. She always wanted to be in the same room with Mother. It was as if she could never leave her side. It was strange." "Strange how?" Miss Marple pressed gently, leaning in slightly, her voice soft but insistent. Eleanor looked away, her breath shallow. "It's hard to explain. It was like she had no life outside of the house. She was always watching, always hovering. I don't know, it just didn't feel right." Miss Marple didn't push further. She could sense Eleanor's discomfort, the way she recoiled from the idea of Miss Lacey's involvement, as if she herself had some unspoken connection to the woman. But there was no use forcing the truth out of her now. Miss Marple would need to find another way to get to the bottom of it. The room felt even smaller now, as if the walls were closing in on her. The weight of the family's secrets seemed to press against her, suffocating her, but she knew that the key to unlocking it all lay somewhere in this very room. She glanced once more at the stack of papers, then at Eleanor's downcast face, trying to make sense of the puzzle that had been presented to her. "I'll leave you to your thoughts for a while," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice almost a whisper as she turned toward the door. "But I'll need you to think carefully, Miss Merton. Think about everything. Nothing is too small, no detail too insignificant. If you remember anything at all, I expect you to tell me." Eleanor nodded, but Miss Marple didn't miss the way her eyes lingered on her, hesitant, uncertain, almost as if she were battling an internal conflict. Miss Marple knew that look. It was the look of someone holding on to a secret they didn't know how to share, a truth that was too painful or too dangerous to admit. As she walked back down the hallway, Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the fragments of what she had learned. The house, the family, the servants, they were all part of a larger web, one that had been carefully constructed over the years, and now, with Caroline Merton's death, that web was beginning to unravel. Miss Marple paused in front of the staircase, her eyes lingering on the faded portraits that lined the walls. A family's legacy, captured in paint and canvas, staring back at her, their faces frozen in time. She could see the pride in their eyes, the weight of their lineage. But behind those eyes, behind the smiles, was something darker, something hidden. She would find it, though. She always did. The sound of footsteps drew her attention, and she turned to find Constable Pierce at the foot of the stairs, his face pale as ever. He cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "We've found something, Miss Marple," he said. "It's Miss Lacey. She's been acting strangely. We found something in her room." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, but she remained composed. "What exactly did you find, Constable?" He hesitated, his voice lower now. "A letter, Miss Marple, addressed to Mrs. Merton. It doesn't look like something a servant would write." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This was the break she had been waiting for, and suddenly, everything was beginning to fall into place. Miss Marple stepped into the dimly lit servants' quarters, the air heavy with a musty scent that seemed to cling to the old stone walls. She had only been in the room for a moment when her eyes were immediately drawn to the small wooden desk in the corner, where a few scattered papers lay in disarray. The letter that Constable Pierce had mentioned was in the midst of the mess, its edges frayed as though it had been handled in haste. The constable stood behind her, shifting uneasily on his feet, his hand twitching at his side as if unsure whether he should speak. Miss Marple gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod, signaling him to keep quiet. Her eyes were fixed on the letter, the neat, elegant handwriting of the woman who had served the Merton family for so many years, a woman who had now become a prime suspect in a murder investigation. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands. The seal had been broken, the envelope slightly torn, but the contents were still intact. With the slightest motion of her fingers, Miss Marple slid the letter from its confines and unfolded it with a deliberate slowness that betrayed the tension building in her chest. The letter was short, just a few lines, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. I can't keep living in the shadows anymore. I've done everything you've asked, but my loyalty is only to you now. The time has come to tell him. I can't hide it any longer. I'll be waiting for you in the place where it all began. We'll be free, once and for all. The words were simple, but they carried an underlying weight of desperation. There was something buried in the letter's few lines that made it clear this wasn't just an ordinary note. It was a confession of sorts, though not one that could easily be understood at first glance. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully once more and looked at Pierce. "We need to speak with Miss Lacey," she said quietly, her voice steady, almost too calm in the face of the turmoil bubbling just beneath the surface. She felt a growing sense of urgency, her mind racing to connect the dots that had, up until now, been scattered and vague. The constable nodded, though there was still hesitation in his movements. "She's not here, Miss Marple. I checked the rest of the house, and she's nowhere to be found. I thought perhaps she might be hiding somewhere, but hiding?" Miss Marple interrupted, her brow furrowing as she studied Pierce closely. "You've checked everywhere." "Everywhere I could think of, yes," Pierce answered, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I even asked Eleanor, but she doesn't seem to know where she's gone." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she considered the implications of the missing servant. A letter like the one she had just read, coupled with Miss Lacey's sudden disappearance, suggested that things were far from simple. There was more at play here than the quiet domestic tragedy the Mertons had wanted the village to believe. Without another word, Miss Marple turned toward the door, her steps deliberate. Pierce followed closely behind, his unease growing with every step they took toward the staircase. The house was still too quiet, the only sounds the distant creaking of floorboards and the rustle of the curtains as the wind outside pressed against the glass. When they reached the drawing room, Miss Marple was immediately struck by the stillness in the air. Eleanor Merton was sitting by the window again, her face turned away as though she were trying to block out the world around her. The soft rustling of paper on the desk was the only sound in the room, though it felt strangely like a prelude to something darker, something unseen. Eleanor didn't look up when they entered, but Miss Marple could feel the tension in the room, thick and suffocating. The young woman had been playing the part of a grieving daughter for far too long. But Miss Marple wasn't fooled. There was something in her demeanor that suggested she knew more than she had let on. Something that made her just as much a part of this mystery as the rest of the family. Miss Marple approached her quietly, standing beside the chair with a calm, almost maternal air. "Miss Merton," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I believe you know more than you've told us. I know this is difficult, but I must ask you to be honest with me. I've seen the letter. I know about Miss Lacey's feelings toward your mother." Eleanor's face, which had been hidden in shadows, flickered with something Miss Marple couldn't quite read. Fear, guilt, anger, or perhaps a combination of all three. Her fingers twisted the handkerchief in her lap, and for a moment she seemed to shrink in on herself, as though the weight of her own conscience was too heavy to bear. I don't know what you mean," Eleanor stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Lacey was just a servant. She had no reason to..." She was more than just a servant, Miss Merton, Miss Marple interrupted gently, but there was no mistaking the firmness in her words. And you know it. I can see it in your eyes. You've been hiding something from everyone, but you can't hide the truth from me. Eleanor flinched, her eyes flicking toward the door as though she were looking for an escape. But there was nowhere to run, not anymore. Not with Miss Marple in the room. I didn't, Eleanor began, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. She paused, struggling for composure. I didn't want her to do it, I swear I didn't, but she was so determined. She thought it would be better this way. Better for whom? Miss Marple asked, her voice a soft but unyielding question. Eleanor's shoulders slumped as she exhaled sharply. My mother, she wasn't happy, not really. And Miss Lacey, she thought that if my mother was gone, things could be different, that we could have... Eleanor stopped herself, as though realizing she had already said too much. Miss Marple didn't press her further. Instead, she turned toward the door. We'll need to speak with Miss Lacey. She's the one who can clear all of this up. But until then, you must be prepared. The truth is coming, and it will not be easy to face. As she left the room, the weight of what Eleanor had said hung heavily in the air. Something had been set into motion, something that could no longer be stopped. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew that the quiet facade of the Merton family was about to shatter, revealing the darkness that had been hidden behind the lace curtains all along. The morning sun had barely broken through the haze of clouds when Miss Marple returned to the Merton house. The streets outside were still damp from the rain that had fallen through the night, and the crisp air hung heavy with the scent of earth and grass. Despite the peace that seemed to blanket the village, inside the house, everything had shifted. What had once been a place of quiet, controlled elegance now felt charged with tension, as though the walls themselves were waiting for the final reveal. Miss Marple entered through the back door this time, her steps sure, her mind still turning over the details she had gathered. She could feel the weight of the puzzle pressing in on her, but she was no closer to understanding all the pieces. Eleanor's confession had added another layer to the mystery, but it hadn't clarified things. If anything, it had raised more questions than it answered. She made her way directly to the library, where Constable Pierce had told her Miss Lacey was likely to be found. The large oak doors creaked open slowly, revealing a room filled with the musty scent of old, leather-bound books and the faint smell of tobacco smoke. Miss Lacey was standing by the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. The older woman looked as though she had been waiting, her stiff posture giving away none of the unease Miss Marple knew she must be feeling. The servant turned slowly as Miss Marple entered, her eyes guarded but not entirely surprised. Miss Marple, she said, her voice steady, but there was a tension in it that betrayed the calm exterior she was trying to project. I suppose you've come to ask me more questions. I have, Miss Lacey, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but clear. She could see the nervous energy in the older woman's eyes, the tightness around her mouth. Miss Lacey was trying to keep her composure, but Miss Marple could tell she was walking a fine line between defiance and fear. The constable stood nearby, a few steps behind, his face set in a neutral expression. Miss Lacey's eyes flickered toward him but didn't linger. She was used to the presence of authority in her home, but something about Miss Marple made her uneasy in a way that was more than just the weight of the investigation. Tell me, Miss Lacey, Miss Marple began, her eyes fixed on the woman's face. What was your relationship with Mrs. Merton? You've been with the family for years, I understand, but I'm sure there are things you haven't shared with the others, things that might be important now. The servant shifted slightly, her fingers tightening behind her back, but her voice remained calm. I've always served the Mertons as I was asked. I've done my duty. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She simply watched Miss Lacey, waiting for something to give. The tension in the room was palpable. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. Finally, Miss Lacey broke the silence. "I cared for Mrs. Merton. She was a kind woman, though not without her faults. She had her struggles, you know, her health, her marriage. Things weren't as perfect as people thought." Miss Marple nodded. "I've heard as much. But tell me, Miss Lacey, why did you write that letter? The one we found in your room. What did you mean by it?" The color drained from Miss Lacey's face, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw the slightest flicker of panic in her eyes. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, but her voice lacked the conviction of someone who was telling the truth. Miss Marple had seen it too many times before, the way people could try to conceal the truth, but their eyes would always betray them. "Of course you do," Miss Marple said gently, her voice steady as she stepped closer. "I've read the letter, Miss Lacey. It's clear that you felt a great deal of loyalty toward Mrs. Merton. But you also mentioned something about not being able to live in the shadows anymore. What did you mean by that?" Miss Lacey swallowed hard, her throat working as though she were trying to force words out that simply wouldn't come. Miss Marple could see the battle taking place inside her, the guilt, the fear, the need to hold on to a secret that was tearing at her from within. "I never wanted it to end this way," Miss Lacey finally said, her voice low and strained. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt, but sometimes things happen, and there's no going back." Miss Marple's eyes never left Miss Lacey's face as she spoke. "What exactly happened, Miss Lacey? Did you have something to do with Mrs. Merton's death?" The question hung in the air, thick and heavy. Miss Lacey's hands trembled slightly, but she didn't break her gaze. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. Miss Marple could feel the older woman's internal struggle, the hesitation that had built up like a dam ready to burst. "Eleanor?" Miss Lacey whispered, her voice barely audible. She was the one. She knew, she always knew, but she couldn't do it. She was too afraid. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but she didn't show it. "What did Eleanor know, Miss Lacey? What was she afraid of?" "She wanted it all," Miss Lacey said, her voice breaking now. "She wanted everything. She was tired of being the daughter, tired of living in her mother's shadow. She wanted to be in control, to have the life she thought she deserved, but she couldn't bring herself to do what needed to be done. So I did." Miss Marple's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. The truth was more tangled than she had imagined, but now, finally, it was clear. The layers of deception, of fear, of ambition, all revealed in that one simple confession. "You killed her?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice a mere thread in the heavy silence of the room. Miss Lacey nodded slowly, the weight of her own guilt evident in the sag of her shoulders. "It was supposed to be quick, just a small dose. She'd fall asleep, and when she woke up, she'd be free. But it didn't go as planned. I didn't mean to kill her." Miss Marple's mind raced. Eleanor had known, but she hadn't been able to do it. Miss Lacey had stepped in, driven by a twisted sense of loyalty and a desire to help. But somewhere along the way, everything had spiraled out of control. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that you've made a terrible mistake, Miss Lacey, and now it's time to face the consequences." The room seemed to hold its breath as the weight of her words settled in. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The morning light was dimmer than usual, as though the clouds above had conspired to shield the village from the harshness of the day. Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing out at the garden below, her hands clasped behind her back as she absorbed the details of the past few hours. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place with an unsettling clarity, but the more she uncovered, the more she realized that things were not as they seemed. What had started as a simple investigation had unraveled into something far more complicated. The Merton family, once a picture of genteel propriety, had hidden more than their fair share of secrets, and now those secrets were beginning to rise to the surface. Constable Pierce had left the room to follow up on some other leads, leaving Miss Marple alone to reflect on what she had learned. Miss Lacey's confession had been unexpected, but not entirely surprising. It had explained much, yet there was still something that didn't sit right. Eleanor's role in the events, while still clouded, loomed large in Miss Marple's mind. The daughter's desire for control, her quiet desperation to escape her mother's shadow. Could it have driven her to manipulate the people around her to the point of murder, or had she been unaware of the darker path Miss Lacey had taken? As the minutes stretched on, Miss Marple's mind worked tirelessly, each thought building upon the last. She recalled the way Eleanor had flinched when she mentioned the letter, the way Miss Lacey had reacted when asked about the family's dynamics. The small gestures, the hesitations, those were the clues, the small pieces of the puzzle that no one else seemed to notice. The soft sound of footsteps broke her reverie, and Miss Marple turned to find Eleanor standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from hours of unshed tears, but she held herself with an odd kind of composure, as though she had steeled herself for something. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, for this moment. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but clear, "I know you have questions, and I know you've been speaking with Miss Lacey." She paused, looking down at her hands, which were twisted together in front of her. "I need to tell you everything. I owe you that much." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady as she met Eleanor's eyes. "You're right. There are things we need to understand, Miss Merton. Things that, until now, have been kept in the shadows." Eleanor's lips trembled, but she pressed on. "My mother wasn't who everyone thought she was. I didn't want anyone to know, especially not the way things turned out. But I have to be honest now. I couldn't stand the way she treated me, the way she controlled everything. I was always in her shadow, always second place to her. She never saw me. Not really." Miss Marple watched her closely, the faintest trace of sympathy in her expression, but she said nothing. She knew better than to rush someone in the middle of their confession. Silence had a way of coaxing out the truth, even when words were hard to find. "She didn't want me to be anything more than what she made me," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "She made sure I stayed small, quiet. She kept me dependent on her. I wanted to be free of it. I wanted to be in charge of my own life, my own future. But she wouldn't let me. Not until I was..." Eleanor paused, her breath catching in her throat. "Until I was no longer her daughter. Until she was gone." Miss Marple could hear the pain in her words, the bitterness that had festered over years of repression and resentment. Eleanor had been trapped in a gilded cage. Now that the door was open, she was ready to walk out, no matter the cost. "Go on," Miss Marple said gently, her voice a soft prod to keep the confession flowing. "I didn't want her dead," Eleanor said quickly, almost too quickly. "I never meant for it to happen. But when Miss Lacey came to me, when she said she could help, I thought maybe it was my only chance to break free." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "Miss Lacey came to you?" Eleanor nodded, her fingers clutching her dress. She had been taking care of my mother for years. She knew things. She knew about my mother's health, about her weaknesses. And she said that she could make it all go away, that she could make it so I wouldn't have to live in that house anymore, always hiding in my mother's shadow." Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice low and steady. "And you agreed? You let her do it?" Eleanor's face twisted with shame, and for the first time Miss Marple saw the true weight of guilt in the young woman's eyes. I didn't think it would go that far. I thought it would just be a little push, a little help. She was going to make it look like an accident. But then everything went wrong. The confession hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor's voice broke as she continued, the words coming faster now, as if she were trying to rid herself of the burden. I was there that night. I was in the house. I heard her scream, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should stop it or let it happen. But I didn't stop it, Miss Marple. I didn't. I just let it happen. Miss Marple felt a deep, uneasy sorrow for the young woman standing before her. Eleanor's actions had been driven by desperation, but desperation alone couldn't excuse what had occurred. There was a line between wanting to escape a painful life and choosing to end another's. Eleanor had crossed that line, and in doing so, had condemned herself. "You didn't stop it," Miss Marple said softly, "but you could have. That is where the guilt lies, Miss Merton. Not in the act itself, but in the choice not to intervene. You could have stopped it." Eleanor's face crumpled, her shoulders shaking as the full weight of her actions settled in. I didn't mean for her to die. I just wanted to be free. I wanted to live for once without her telling me what to do." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but she didn't look away. "Freedom," she murmured, "often comes at a price, Miss Merton. And sometimes that price is too steep to pay." Eleanor's sobs filled the room, the sound echoing off the walls as Miss Marple stood silently, watching the young woman unravel before her. There would be consequences. There would be no escape from the law, but Miss Marple could not help but wonder what might have become of Eleanor had she been given the chance to grow into her own, without the constant weight of her mother's expectations. The tragedy was not just in the death of Caroline Merton, but in the life of a daughter who had been pushed too far, too soon. The truth had finally come out, and now the world would have to reckon with it. But Miss Marple knew that sometimes the hardest truths were the ones we kept hidden from ourselves. The evening had settled over the village like a quiet shroud, the streets now dark save for the soft glow of lanterns and the occasional light flickering in the windows of homes. Inside the Merton house, the air felt stifling, heavy with the weight of secrets finally brought to the surface. Miss Marple sat alone in the drawing room, the faint hum of the fire in the hearth the only sound that filled the room. She had given Eleanor time to process her confession, time to understand the gravity of her actions, but Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Her mind continued to work, turning over the details, piecing together the fragments of truth that had emerged. There were too many unanswered questions, too many half-revealed motives. Eleanor's desperation had driven her to let Miss Lacey carry out the act she had been too fearful to commit herself, but it still didn't explain everything. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she realized that the case was not as simple as it seemed. The lines between victim and perpetrator had blurred, and the consequences of their choices had created a tangled web from which there was no easy escape. The door opened quietly, and Miss Marple's eyes flickered up to see Constable Pierce standing in the doorway. He looked more unsettled than usual, his normally composed demeanor now strained. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low, "I've just received word. They've found something at Miss Lacey's, a box, hidden in the floorboards of her room." Miss Marple's interest piqued, and she rose from her chair, her movements slow but purposeful. "What kind of box?" she asked, her voice steady but her mind already racing. Pierce hesitated, glancing toward the door as though unsure whether he should continue. "I'm not sure of all the details, but there were letters and, well, there was more. Papers that looked like they could belong to Mrs. Merton, ones I haven't seen before." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened as she moved toward the door. She had suspected all along that Miss Lacey's loyalty had not been as pure as it appeared. The older woman had been the perfect servant, one who had served the Merton family for years, but Miss Marple had sensed something deeper beneath her calm exterior. The discovery of the hidden box confirmed what she had only half acknowledged. Miss Lacey had been involved in more than just the physical care of the family. "Let's go," Miss Marple said simply, her tone unwavering. The walk to Miss Lacey's quarters felt longer than it should have, as though the house itself was closing in around them. When they arrived, Pierce pushed the door open cautiously, his gaze darting about the room as though expecting something to leap out at them. Miss Marple entered without hesitation, her eyes scanning the space for anything that might offer a clue. The room was modest, sparsely furnished, but there was a sense of order to it, everything in its place, every item carefully arranged. It looked, on the surface, like the quarters of any well-kept servant, yet there was an undercurrent of something amiss. The box Pierce had mentioned sat near the foot of the bed, its corners worn, its wood scratched and faded from years of neglect. It wasn't large, but it seemed to exude a quiet malevolence, as though it held more than just forgotten trinkets. Miss Marple approached it carefully, her eyes never leaving the box as she knelt beside it. Her fingers hovered over the lid for a moment before she lifted it, revealing the contents inside. Papers, old, yellowed, were stacked in neat piles, their edges curled with age. There were letters, some addressed to Mrs. Merton, others to someone else, perhaps Miss Lacey's own correspondence. Pierce stepped closer, his curiosity obvious, but his unease still palpable. "What do you think, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice hushed. Without speaking, Miss Marple began to sift through the papers, her fingers moving deliberately as she examined each one. Some of the letters were personal, others seemed more official. It was clear that Miss Lacey had kept these documents hidden for a reason. Documents that didn't belong to her, but to the Mertons. She paused at one letter, the handwriting sharp and familiar. It was from Mrs. Merton, and the tone was unmistakable. Cool, controlled, but with an undercurrent of something more. Miss Marple read the letter silently, her mind piecing together the words as they fell into place. The message was cryptic, but its meaning was clear. A promise had been made. A secret had been shared. She handed the letter to Pierce, who took it reluctantly, his brow furrowing as he scanned the words. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "What is this about? There's no mention of anything we've discovered." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "You're right, Constable. There's more to this than meets the eye. Mrs. Merton was not the simple, suffering wife that people believed her to be. She had her own plans, her own secrets." She continued sifting through the box, her mind slowly making connections as she examined. Each letter, each scrap of paper. There were references to money, large sums, hidden in a way that made it clear the family had been keeping something from the outside world. Mrs. Merton had been involved in something far more complicated than just her marriage and family life. There was mention of a business deal, something that had gone awry, something that had left her in a position of vulnerability. Miss Lacey had known about it. Perhaps she had been trying to protect Mrs. Merton, or perhaps she had been trying to use the information for her own gain. "You see, Constable," Miss Marple said quietly, "this isn't just about a daughter seeking freedom. This is about power, who controls it, who has access to it, and who is willing to go to great lengths to keep it hidden." Pierce stared at her, his expression confused. "But what does that mean for Mrs. Merton's death? Did Miss Lacey—" Miss Marple cut him off with a small shake of her head. "Not entirely. Miss Lacey was a willing participant, but she wasn't the mastermind. The motivations for this death run deeper. It's about a family's legacy and about control over something that has been buried for too long." She stood up, closing the box gently, her eyes lingering on the hidden contents one last time. The room felt heavier now, the weight of the secrets it held pressing in on her. "The truth is complicated, Constable, but we are getting closer, and soon it will all come to light." The evening had deepened into a cool, oppressive quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break it. The fire in the drawing room had long since burned down to embers, and Miss Marple sat by the window, her eyes focused on the dimming world outside. The village, with its quaint cottages and winding streets, looked peaceful, unaware of the storm brewing within the walls of the Merton estate. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. One last piece remained, one final truth to be uncovered. Constable Pierce had left some time ago to follow up on a lead, and Miss Marple was alone, but she wasn't without company. Her mind kept turning, chasing the last details that didn't quite fit, the pieces of the puzzle that, despite all her effort, still seemed to hover just out of reach. She had already uncovered so much. The hidden letters, Miss Lacey's involvement, the role Eleanor had played. Yet there remained a lingering sense of unease, as though something else was lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to emerge. The soft click of footsteps broke the stillness of the room, and Miss Marple turned to see Eleanor standing in the doorway. Her face was drawn, her features pale, but there was something in her eyes now that Miss Marple hadn't seen before, a kind of resolution, an understanding that she was, perhaps, about to face the consequences of her actions. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Eleanor said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. She stood a few feet away, as though unsure whether to come closer, to enter the room fully. Miss Marple gestured to the chair opposite hers, her voice calm and steady. "You don't have to say anything more, Miss Merton. I believe I know all that I need to, but I imagine you have your reasons for being here." Eleanor hesitated for a moment longer before slowly sitting down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes darted to the fire, but it seemed as though the flickering flames could not offer her any comfort. She had already confessed so much, and yet Miss Marple knew there was still something holding her back. "I thought," Eleanor began, her voice wavering as she chose her words carefully, "that I could be free. I thought that if my mother was gone, everything would be different, that I could have control, that I could finally have a life of my own. But it was a lie, and now I see what it cost." Miss Marple watched her closely, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. The pain and regret were evident in the young woman's expression, but Miss Marple knew that Eleanor wasn't just talking about the loss of her mother. She was speaking of something deeper, something far more complicated than the simple desire for freedom. "You didn't just want to be free, did you?" Miss Marple said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "It wasn't just about escaping your mother's control. There's more to it than that." Eleanor's eyes flickered toward Miss Marple, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, she spoke, her words slow and deliberate. "I didn't want to be my mother's daughter anymore. I wanted to be more than that. I wanted to be someone else. Someone who had power, someone who wasn't always second to her. But I didn't realize." She stopped herself, her voice faltering. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze intent. "You didn't realize what, Miss Merton?" Eleanor's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "I didn't realize what it would cost to kill her, even if it wasn't, not directly. But I didn't stop it. I let Miss Lacey do it. I thought she could handle it. I thought it would be easy. But now I can't escape it." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of guilt and the crushing realization that Eleanor had played a far more active role in her mother's death than she had admitted at first. It was no longer just a matter of being a passive participant. Eleanor had been complicit in the murder, had allowed it to happen when she could have stopped it. The act of liberation had, in her mind, been justified by the promise of control, but it had only led to the destruction of everything she had known. "Freedom is a powerful thing," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "But it can be a dangerous illusion. It makes us believe we can control our lives, our futures. It makes us think that we can shape things to our will. But in reality, freedom comes with a cost, and sometimes that cost is too high to bear." Eleanor looked up then, her eyes filled with tears that she no longer tried to hide. "What do I do now? What happens to me?" Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind already weighing the options, already considering the consequences of Eleanor's actions. "The law must take its course, Miss Merton," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "You cannot run from what has been done. No one can." Eleanor nodded slowly, her shoulders slumped as though the weight of her guilt had finally crushed her resolve. "I know," she whispered. "I've known that for a long time. I just didn't want to face it." There was a long silence between them, the crackling of the fire the only sound that filled the room. Miss Marple let Eleanor sit in the quiet for a moment, allowing her the space to process what she had just admitted. But Miss Marple's thoughts were already on the next step. The truth had been revealed, the pieces were in place, but there was still one more thing to address. "I'll make sure you're not alone in this, Miss Merton," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "But you must face what you've done, and you must accept the consequences. There's no other way." Eleanor swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the floor, her shoulders trembling. "I understand. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything." Miss Marple said nothing, but her gaze softened. Sometimes, the hardest part of the truth was not accepting the consequences, but acknowledging the cost of one's choices. The line between justice and mercy had always been thin. And in this case, Miss Marple knew that the young woman would have to walk that line alone. But in the end, it was the only way to heal the damage done, to make peace with a past that could never be undone. The fire continued to crackle in the hearth, its warm glow casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the first stars had begun to appear in the sky, distant and cold, like the truth that had finally emerged from the darkness. The days that followed were filled with a grim sense of inevitability, the kind that lingered over the Merton house like a storm cloud that had yet to break. Miss Marple had done all she could. She had pieced together the truth, one delicate thread at a time, and now the weight of it rested not only on Eleanor's shoulders, but on the entire family legacy. The truth had a way of coming out, no matter how long it took, and when it did, it never left quietly. It always demanded something in return. Eleanor had been taken to the local constable's office for further questioning, and Miss Marple had no illusions about what would come next. The law would do its work, but the damage had already been done. The young woman would be judged by her actions, and rightly so. Yet, as Miss Marple sat in the quiet of the drawing room, her mind drifted back to the moments when she had seen that flicker of something more in Eleanor's eyes. A yearning for a different life, perhaps, but also a profound and tragic misunderstanding of what freedom truly meant. Outside the house, the village had returned to its routine. The market square was filled with the usual chatter of vendors and customers, the sounds of children playing in the streets, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The world had not stopped turning, despite the ripple of chaos that had swept through the Merton family. Miss Marple knew this all too well. Life, for most people, continued on as if nothing had changed, even though for some, everything had been altered forever. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Constable Pierce standing in the doorway. He looked worn, as though the weight of the past few days had taken its toll on him. His uniform was slightly rumpled, his posture rigid with the tension that seemed to cling to him. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low. "The Merton case. It's nearly done. We've spoken to Miss Lacey, and she's been cooperative. Eleanor's confession, combined with the evidence, has made everything clear. But there's something I need to ask you." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "What is it, Constable?" Pierce hesitated for a moment, as though weighing his words carefully. "The family's estate, the property. It seems there are complications. In the letters we found, there were references to assets, money, properties, investments, things that didn't quite make sense in the context of the family's public image. It's as if they were hiding something. And I can't help but wonder if there's more to this than just Eleanor's desire to break free." Miss Marple considered this carefully. her fingers lightly tapping the armrest of the chair. "Yes, that's been nagging at me as well," she said thoughtfully. Eleanor's actions, while driven by a need for control, weren't just about her personal freedom. There was something more at play, something beneath the surface. The family's wealth, their position. Perhaps that was a factor. Pierce nodded, though his face remained troubled. But why would Mrs. Merton keep all of this hidden? If she had access to such resources, why not use them for her own benefit? Why involve Miss Lacey? Why let things get so out of control? Miss Marple's gaze turned distant as she pondered the question. It wasn't about using the resources for herself, Constable. I believe Mrs. Merton had another plan entirely. She had always been a woman in control, but perhaps she feared losing that control. If the truth about her wealth and the family's dealings had come to light, she might have lost her place in the world. Perhaps it wasn't just her daughter. She was trying to keep in the dark. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more it seemed clear that the family's desire for secrecy was rooted not in greed, but in fear. Fear of exposure, fear of the truth coming to light, and fear of losing everything they had worked so hard to build. Eleanor, in her desperation to escape her mother's control, had failed to see that she too had been part of that same system. One built on hidden truths, on wealth and power that were never meant to be questioned. "I've spoken with the other servants, Miss Marple," Pierce continued, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "None of them knew about the money or the properties. It seems Mrs. Merton was very careful about keeping it all hidden. Miss Lacey, well, she wasn't quite as oblivious as she seemed. She had her suspicions, but she was loyal. I think she thought that helping Eleanor would finally put an end to the tension between them. Loyalty is a dangerous thing when it's misplaced," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice laced with a trace of sadness. And in Miss Lacey's case, it cost her more than she realized. She was drawn into something far darker than she ever expected. But she too was a product of the Merton family's secrets. She was as much a part of their hidden life as anyone. There was a long pause, the silence stretching between them until Pierce finally spoke again, his voice more subdued. "What happens now, Miss Marple? With Eleanor?" Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her eyes remained sharp, full of the wisdom gained from years of seeing the complexities of human nature. "The law will deal with Eleanor, Constable, and while justice must be served, we must remember that the tragedy here extends beyond her actions. Eleanor was a product of her circumstances, of a life shaped by her mother's control, and a system built on secrecy." Pierce seemed to absorb this in silence, nodding slowly. "I understand, but I can't help but feel—" Miss Marple cut him off gently. "It's easy to feel sympathy, Constable. It's natural. But we must also remember that there are consequences. Eleanor must face those consequences, no matter the reason behind her actions." The weight of the words settled heavily in the room, and Pierce stood for a moment, as if contemplating something. "You're right. The truth was buried for so long, and now it's come out in the most painful way possible." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the window once more, the world outside still and quiet, the night settling in with a kind of finality. "The truth has a way of doing that, Constable. It never stays buried forever. It may take time and it may take pain, but eventually the truth always comes to light, and when it does, all that remains is the cost of it." The fire in the hearth flickered one last time before settling into quiet ashes, and the room fell into a deep, thoughtful silence. There was nothing more to say. The truth had been revealed, and the world outside would carry on, unchanged. But within these walls, nothing would ever be the same again. The days following Eleanor's confession felt heavy, as though the very air around the Merton house had thickened with the weight of all that had been revealed. Miss Marple had watched as the family's secrets were slowly peeled away, layer by painful layer, and now, as the investigation reached its final stages, she felt an odd sense of inevitability settle in her chest. She had seen cases like this before. Cases where the truth seemed too terrible to be acknowledged, where the consequences seemed far too great for the actions that had precipitated them. Yet, in her experience, justice always found its way. It might not always be swift, and it might not always be clean, but it would come. Miss Marple sat in the same drawing room where so much had transpired, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The room, once filled with the warmth of conversation and laughter, now felt cold and hollow, as though the very fabric of the house had absorbed the sorrow and guilt that had been etched into its walls. The fire in the hearth was dying down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the room, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. The door creaked open, and Miss Marple turned to see Constable Pierce entering, his face worn with the strain of the past few days. His uniform, still neat, couldn't quite hide the fatigue that seemed to cling to him. He had been involved in the investigation from the very beginning, and Miss Marple knew how much this case had taken out of him. He had tried to maintain his composure, but the weight of the truth had begun to show in the lines around his eyes. "Miss Marple," Pierce said quietly, his voice hoarse as though he hadn't slept properly in days. "It's over." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "I thought it might be. The wheels of justice turn, albeit slowly." He took a deep breath, standing in the doorway for a moment before stepping further into the room. "Eleanor's been formally charged. There will be a trial, but it's going to be a long process. I don't know what to expect, but I think we can all agree that her future is uncertain." Miss Marple regarded him with a quiet understanding. Her future is uncertain, yes, but Eleanor's fate was sealed the moment she made the choice to let her mother die. There's no undoing that, no matter the circumstances, no matter the reasons behind it. Pierce nodded, his gaze drifting to the fire as though seeking some comfort from the flickering flames. I keep thinking that if we had known sooner, if there had been a way to prevent this, maybe we could have done something." "There is no if, Constable," Miss Marple replied gently, her voice steady. "We cannot change what has already been done. All we can do now is move forward." Pierce looked at her then, a mixture of guilt and frustration in his eyes. "It's just hard to accept, you know. She was so young, and Miss Lacey, she was no saint, but she wasn't the one who should have been blamed for all of this. She was simply trying to follow orders." Miss Marple's eyes softened as she considered the complexities of the situation. Miss Lacey's role was significant, certainly, but she too was trapped by the web of lies and secrets that Mrs. Merton wove around her family. Loyalty to someone like Mrs. Merton can be dangerous. It can cloud judgment, cloud morality. But in the end, Miss Lacey wasn't the one who made the final choice. Eleanor was. There was a long pause, the only sound the crackling of the fire as it settled into a low hum. Pierce seemed to consider her words carefully before speaking again. "Do you think Eleanor will ever be able to forgive herself?" Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant. "Forgiveness is a tricky thing, Constable. I believe Eleanor will struggle with it for the rest of her life. She may seek forgiveness from others, but the hardest forgiveness is the one we give ourselves. She must live with the consequences of her choices." "But will she?" Pierce asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "Will she ever really understand what she's done? Will she ever truly grasp how much damage she's caused?" "I think she already understands," Miss Marple replied softly. "Perhaps not fully, but she is beginning to. The truth has a way of sinking in, no matter how hard we try to fight it. It's the kind of truth that takes root deep inside, and over time, it changes everything." Pierce ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the movement. "It just feels so unfair, to lose everything, just like that, to have it all fall apart. I keep thinking about the family, about what could have been." Miss Marple's gaze softened, her voice almost a whisper. "Life has a way of tearing things apart, Constable, but sometimes it's the only way for the truth to emerge. You can't rebuild what was built on lies. Not truly. The foundation was already cracked. There was another long silence between them, a quiet understanding that hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Pierce finally nodded, though his expression remained conflicted. I just wish things had turned out differently. I wish she hadn't made those choices. I do too, Miss Marple said quietly. But we cannot change the past. We can only move forward. The room grew colder as the fire dwindled further, and the first sounds of the night outside began to fill the space. The world was moving on, as it always did, regardless of the tragedies that had unfolded within the Merton house. Yet, for those who had lived through the chaos, the aftermath would always remain, a shadow that would never quite fade. I'll see to it that the case is handled with care, Pierce said after a long pause, his voice resolute. We'll make sure justice is done. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes still fixed on the fading embers in the hearth. Justice, yes. But sometimes justice isn't enough. Sometimes the price is too high. As Pierce turned to leave, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her thoughts turning inward. The truth had come to light, but it had left a trail of destruction in its wake. The Merton family would never be the same. Eleanor would never be the same. And as for Miss Lacey, well, she too would face the consequences of her choices. The night deepened around the house, and with it the sense of finality that had settled in the air. There would be no more secrets, no more lies, only the harsh reality of what had been done. And now, there was only the long, painful process of accepting the consequences. The trial had come and gone, a quiet affair compared to what Miss Marple had anticipated. The courtroom was filled with the usual assortment of onlookers. Villagers eager for gossip, a few family members in mourning, and the occasional curious spectator. Eleanor had stood before the judge with the same quiet resignation that had filled her since her confession. Her eyes, once full of defiance, were now empty, a reflection of the weight she carried. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no escape from it now. The court had been quick in its decision. Eleanor had been convicted of manslaughter, not murder, a verdict that seemed to balance the severity of her actions with the mitigating circumstances. Her young age, her emotional turmoil, and the undeniable manipulation by Miss Lacey had all been factors in the sentencing. She would serve time, though the exact duration remained uncertain. What mattered, however, was that justice had been served, even if the cost had been high. Miss Lacey, too, had faced her share of consequences. Her role in the crime, though not as direct as Eleanor's, had been pivotal. She had been sentenced for her part in the plot, though her punishment had been less severe than Eleanor's. It was clear to everyone that she too had been a victim of her own misplaced loyalty, but that did little to absolve her. She had been complicit, and the law had seen fit to punish her accordingly. The Merton estate, once a symbol of wealth and privilege, had been slowly dismantled. The property was now in the hands of a trustee, with the proceeds being used to settle the debts Mrs. Merton had kept hidden from the public eye. What had once been a carefully guarded legacy had crumbled under the weight of the secrets it had carried for so long. The family's wealth, their reputation, everything they had built, had come crashing down. Miss Marple stood on the steps of the courthouse, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The sky was overcast, a reminder of the gloom that had settled over the village. The trial had been necessary, of course, but Miss Marple couldn't shake the sense that it was all too late. The damage had already been done. There was no undoing the hurt, no erasing the choices that had led them all here. Constable Pierce stood beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets. His gaze was distant, though his posture had relaxed slightly since the trial. "I never thought it would end like this," he said, his voice low. "I thought maybe, somehow it would turn out differently, that Eleanor would be different." Miss Marple glanced at him, her expression soft but knowing. Eleanor was a product of her upbringing, Constable. She had been molded by a life of control, of secrets, and it became too much for her to bear. She wanted freedom, but she couldn't understand the cost of it. "You think she'll ever find peace?" Pierce asked, his voice tinged with the same uncertainty that had lingered throughout the investigation. Miss Marple paused, considering the question carefully. Peace is a difficult thing to find when you've made choices like hers. It's not something that comes easily, not when the consequences are so profound. But Eleanor will have to find a way to live with herself, just as we all must. The two of them stood there in silence for a moment, watching as the last of the courthouse visitors trickled away, their faces shadowed by the weight of the day's events. The village, too, would move on, as it always did. Life would continue, as it had before, but the Merton family, what was left of it, would never be the same. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple turned her gaze back toward the courthouse. She felt, in some small way, a sense of finality settle over her. She had seen the truth, had followed the threads of the mystery until they had led her here. The case was closed, and though justice had been served, there would be no real winners. The Mertons had lost everything, mother, daughter, and legacy, and what remained would never be enough to restore the shattered pieces. "Sometimes, Constable," Miss Marple said softly, "justice isn't about finding the truth alone. It's about understanding the cost of that truth. It's about knowing that sometimes the price is too high to pay." Pierce nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "I think I finally get that now, Miss Marple. I think I finally understand." With a final glance at the courthouse, Miss Marple turned away. The road ahead would be long, for Eleanor and for Miss Lacey. There would be no easy path to redemption, no quick way to rebuild what had been lost. But life, as it often did, would carry on. People would remember the Mertons, their story, their tragedy, but time would slowly soften the edges of their memory until it was just another tale of loss and regret. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind already shifting to the next mystery, the next puzzle to solve. It was a strange thing, she thought, how the world kept turning even in the face of such profound tragedy. But perhaps that was the greatest truth of all, that the world would always move forward, no matter what had happened before. And with that thought, Miss Marple walked away from the courthouse, leaving behind a legacy of secrets and consequences, and stepping into the quiet, inevitable future.